Now we're going to today, for our world history lecture, we're going to look at the Mongols and the Ming Dynasty, and this is going to be in two parts. So we're going to start off by looking at the Mongols in world history in what we call the post-classical period. What we see here is your typical Mongol warrior mounted on a small pony with a compound bow. These bows were made of sinew from some of the animals that they herded. This is a very mobile society because we're going to see that they're nomadic, and they're very good at war, and we'll talk about why that is. So, the Mongols. The Mongols are going to be a Central Asian people. As such, they're going to be nomadic. Central Asia is pretty dry, as you can see in the satellite map, and so there's lots of grassland. And so it makes sense that they can't be farmers because it's too dry, but there is lots of grass, and so they have lots of grazing animals. They're going to raise camels and goats, and they're going to raise horses. And so these animals, in order to get enough food and water, we're going to have to go from watering hole to watering hole and from pasture land to pasture land. And so they're always on the move, these nomadic people. Now, in the past, they've been nomadic people. Typically, are very warlike because they're fighting over a resource, whether it's pasture land or watering hole, and so they're divided up into related clans that are constantly waging war with one another because they're fighting over these scarce resources. And so we see that for most of their existence up until this point, the nomadic people, or the Mongols, who are one of these nomad groups in Central Asia, they're not going to be a big player on the world stage at this point until this point, because they're always fighting against each other, and they haven't expanded out because they're spending all of their time kind of in internal warfare from one family tribe to another. That is, of course, until Temujin, or as he'll later be called, Genghis Khan. So Temujin, or Genghis Khan, he is from one of these small Mongol nomadic people, and he's a very good warrior, even from a young age. And so he starts uniting his tribal clans in his area. And he convinces them to, instead of fighting against each other, we should combine together and then take our fighting out. We'll be more successful that way instead of constantly tearing each other down. And so he unites the clans, and they start their rapid rise to power and conquest. Now they're very good warriors because they've always been warriors to kind of fight over, like I said, watering holes and pasture land. And so when they take that warfare and they move it out and they unite, they're almost an unstoppable foe. And so what you see here in the red is the homeland of the Mongols. And as they come together and get more and more and more nomadic clans under their control, they're going to create this huge horde of warriors. And really nobody can stop them because they're so mobile. They're such good archers on horseback and warriors on horseback that they can travel 100 miles a day. And so they can rapidly strike places that you would normally think would be out of their control and take people by surprise. And so they're going to attack the Sung dynasty, the southern Sung dynasty, and eventually conquer them. They're also going to replace the Seljuk Empire that we've talked about before, a Turkish empire that were themselves nomads in the past, but have since settled down, and they're going to take out that area and create a Mongol rule. And then eventually, later on, descendants of the Mongols are going to take over India. But during the time of Genghis Khan and his grandson, or Kublai Khan, we'll see that they will try to invade India, but they will fail because the hot humidity of India kind of makes their bows fall apart, and they can't really use their horses to much extent because India is not as much a flat plain. And so we see that this is one of the rare examples where Genghis Khan's armies try to take an area and fail. But no worries, a descendant of Genghis Khan, Timur, is eventually going to take over the Sultanate of Delhi, conquer it, and then create something called the Mughal Empire, which we'll be talking about in the next unit, right? But Genghis Khan himself does not take India, but his descendants do. All right. And so we see that all of these empires are eventually, at one point or another, going to be wiped out by these Central Asian nomads. So here we have this interesting quote that was a contemporary talking about Genghis Khan and what he likes to do. And it says, his greatest pleasure in life was making war, defeating enemies, forcing their beloved, their wives, to weep, riding their horses, embracing their wives and daughters. And so, this was the goal of the Mongols' army, was to go out, expand, get wealth by taking people's horses, grab women and make them part of their society, and steal their stuff. And it was a raiding, conquering empire that rapidly spread to cover really most of Asia when they're all said and done. And so here we see the fullest extent of the Mongol Empire. It's absolutely enormous. Right, and so the ironic thing is after Genghis Khan and his descendants conquer most of Asia, what they do is they don't want to wage war inside their empire. They're all about conquering new areas, but they want peace and stability inside their empire because they know, as most empires do, that if we increase trade within our empire, we can tax it. And so trade brings wealth, wealth brings power, and so we're going to see that there's relatively free, unmolested trade from one end of Asia to the other during the height of the Mongol Empire. And so this is primarily on the Silk Roads. And so the Mongols, now the Silk Roads existed before the Mongols, but because of the Mongols, Silk Road trade goes way up because it's just physically safe to trade from one end to the other, from China to Southwest Asia. And so, in fact, this time is so peaceful that that historians call it the time of Pax Mongolia. Pax means peace. So it's the Mongolian peace. So over here in this picture, we see that the Mongols would issue a merchant this medallion, and it would basically say that whoever has this medallion has the protection of the Mongol Empire. And if anybody tries to steal or mess with this merchant, the whole might of the Mongol Empire will come down on you, right? And so we see that, trade goes up. Whenever you have big empires in world history, we see trade going up. So here's a quote from a historian who said, "Merchants enjoyed such a peace that a man might have journeyed from the land of the sunrise, East Asia, to the land of the sunset, Southwest Asia, with a golden platter upon his head without suffering the least violence from anyone." Well, that may be a slight exaggeration, but the principle is true, right? So the most important thing to know here is that the Silk Road trade is going to go up because it's just so safe to do it. You don't have to worry about getting robbed or killed on the way, so more people are going to be merchants. Now, another thing that we need to know about this, since trade is going up, we're going to see artisans moving back and forth across the Silk Roads. The Mongols themselves are a nomadic people, and so they spend their time either warring or, raising horses or camels or goats, like I said, repairing their yurts, that's where they live, the houses they're called, and so they don't really have time to be an artisan. They don't have time to have tools where they can sit down in one place and be a goldsmith or a silversmith or a blacksmith or anything like that. And so the Mongols either have to steal that stuff, raid it from people, or they have to trade for it. In the past. But now that we have this big, huge empire, there becomes more of a need internally for the Mongol Empire to have artisans, right? Why should we be dependent on either raiding or trading to get the stuff we need? And so wherever the Mongol armies go, when they sack a city or take a city, they will spare the lives of the artisans, and they will bring them back to Mongolia to be artisans that now the Mongols can produce their own goods. And so we see artisanal products go across the Silk Roads, but we also see the knowledge of these artisans and how to make things go across the Silk Roads. Right. So, what are we seeing traveling across the Silk Roads under Mongol protection? Obviously silk. That's why it gets its name. And so silk, of course, comes from silkworms that grow and do their thing over in China. And so the silk trade is going to be done in stages. And so we've talked about this. Merchants will go from oasis to oasis in Central Asia, and they'll just go back and forth, right? So if I'm a merchant who lives in this oasis, I will trade. I will get some silk goods from the people east of me, and I will then take it to the oasis next and trade it with a merchant there, right? And so as we do these numerous stops along the Silk Roads, right? Trade route, oasis, oasis, oasis. Of course, as it moves from east to west, the price of silk goes up increasingly because every merchant is going to hopefully double the price. They're going to sell it for double the price of what they bought it for to make money. And so silk is relatively cheap in China, but when you get to Southwest Asia and the Islamic empires and eventually even Europe, that silk is going to be really expensive. The same with porcelain, which is like fine dishes and pottery that's made in China, and of course spices too. And so there's a lot of money to be made on the Silk Roads because you're buying it for a cheaper price and selling it for a higher price. And as we do these stops all along the Silk Roads. Right. Also, in a previous lecture, we've talked about how the Sung dynasty, who was before the Mongols, were mass producing iron and steel. And so there is a huge market for that in the rest of the world, for tools, for farming, and for weapons. And so this will be another product that is going to be transported on the Silk Roads. Now, what is coming on the Silk Roads from India? Well, we have spices. There's lots of spices in India that are going to be used, and also spices coming in from Southeast Asia to India and then put on the Silk Roads. And so we're going to see them. And of course, India has lots of gems because they have the Himalayan mountains, and we mine gems in mountains. And so rubies and emeralds and diamonds are also going to make their way onto the Silk Roads from India. Now, what is coming from west to east? Well, in the Islamic world and in the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Empire, we're going to see that they're famous for their rugs in Persia and the Byzantine Empire, also glassware. And eventually, they're going to steal how to make silk from the Chinese. There's this wonderful story of this monk who goes to China and he steals a bunch of silkworms and he puts them in his cane along with some mulberry leaves that they eat. And he takes those silkworms all the way back to the Byzantine Empire. They survive and they start making their own silk. And so we're going to see eventually silk also go from west to east as well. And so we have all of these mostly luxury goods traveling back and forth from one end of the Asian empire, Asia to the other in the Mongolian Empire. And so all of this trade just increases exponentially because it's safe to travel and trade. All right, but it's not just goods that travel on the Silk Roads, it's also religions. And so we're going to see, we've already seen in previous lectures how Buddhism starts in India, right? And then monks and merchants, the M&M boys as we've talked about them, they're going to key in on the Silk Roads and they're going to spread Buddhism to China. Or they're going to go through Indian Ocean trade and spread Buddhism down here to Southeast Asia, right? And so we see Buddhism spreading on the Silk Roads, right? Islam is going to spread on the Silk Roads. Islam starts over here in Mecca, and then it's going to, through conquest and merchants and Sufi monks, and missionaries, it's going to spread on the Silk Roads to this area. And so we're going to see Muslims now in Central Asia because of the Silk Roads. There's also going to be another religion that is called Nestorian Christianity. And that's going to travel on the Silk Roads. So a lot of these merchants and some of the Mongols themselves are going to convert to Nestorian Christianity. It's a version of Christianity, and we don't have to go into too much of the theology here, but basically they separate them. They're different than other Christians at this time because they have disagreements over the divinity or the holiness of Jesus, whether he was God made man on earth or was he just a man who was divinely inspired by God. The Nestorians believe the latter, that he was a man that was divinely inspired by God, not God on earth. Well, like I said, we don't need to go into too much of the theology here, but needless to say, other Christians disagreed with the Nestorians, and the Nestorians are persecuted, and so they move away from the rest of the Christians, and they move into Persia right here, which is mostly a Muslim country. And here in Persia, they're going to be protected as a people of the book, and they're going to have their own little diasporic communities of Christians, and they're going to be called millets, and we've talked about this before. A millet is a small community of a religious community or ethnic community within a larger majority that's different. And they're going to have, and Muslim empires are going to let them have their own rules and laws. They won't have to follow Sharia as long as they pay their taxes, they pay their jizya, they pay their religious tax, and they follow the basic laws of the empire. But on a day-to-day level, they have their own rules. And so we have this little community, this little millet community of Christians inside Islamic empires. Well, a lot of these Muslims are going to become merchants, and so we have some of these Nestorian Christians who will convert some merchants, or who will just always be Christians and then just become merchants, and they will start to spread on the Silk Roads, as merchants do, spreading their goods but also talking about their faith. And so Nestorian Christianity will spread because of merchants. But we also see that some of the Mongols, they embrace Nestorian Christianity. In fact, Genghis Khan, he has several wives that are Nestorian Christians. And so because of that, we're going to see Nestorian Christians in oasis towns all up and down the Silk Roads. And in fact, we're going to see many Christian churches over here in China when the Mongols are ruling China during the Yuan dynasty. And so here's a great example of a religion spreading. So Buddhism, Islam, and Christianity, and Nestorian Christianity are spreading on the Silk Roads. Next, we have a new site. It looks very similar to the last one, but it's not just trade goods and religions that are spreading, but also languages are spreading on the Silk Roads. And so Muslim merchants are going to spread Arabic on the Silk Roads. And then also we have these Turkish people. Turks are another group of Central Asian nomads. And some of these Turkish people are going to speak Uyghur. And so here we see Uyghur, and it is a combination of Turkish and Arabic and Persian languages kind of all mashed up into one. So it's a syncretic language. And a lot of the merchants on the Silk Roads are going to be these Uyghurs, and they're going to travel and they're going to spread their language with them. And so eventually it even goes into China. And so today in China, we have actually a pretty large group of people that are Uyghurs that are living over here in Western China that are Muslim, and they speak this language. Of course, the Chinese government is doing some pretty horrible things to them at this point in time. In 2020, they're being persecuted by the Chinese state because they are not like the rest of China, and they are Muslim, and so that's a different lecture. But we see that even today we see Uyghurs all over throughout Central Asia as because of the Silk Road trade. All right, and then the next thing we have that's spreading on the Silk Roads, it's something that's certainly not wanted, but is spreading anyway, and that's plague. That's the bubonic plague or the Black Death. And so we see that probably the Black Death or the bubonic plague, this virus originates in China, and just as merchants trade back and forth across the Silk Roads, it's going to make its way from China to India, to Southwest Asia. So it starts here, and that's number one, and then it's going to find itself in India through trade, and then it's going to go into the Muslim world, and eventually, at the end of the time period, or kind of mid-time period, I guess, to the end, we're going to see it enter Europe and wipe out a lot of the population there. And so we see that the Black Death is going from one place to the other. Now, there are some places in the world that, yes, we do see lots of plague, but it's not as much as in other places. So in the Muslim world, they do have the plague, the Black Death, but it's not as deadly as it is in Europe, because Muslims at this time are supposed to wash and keep clean as part of their faith. So we're Jews, it's part of their faith. And so just because of that cleanliness, we see that the Black Death or the plague, the virus, is just not as contagious because they're keeping things clean. Now in Europe at this time, there wasn't really an emphasis on cleanliness. In fact, a lot of people only bathe maybe once or twice a year. People are living in packed cities in Europe that we'll get to later, small cities, but cities. And so the plague is going to spread like crazy in Europe. It also is going to spread a lot in China for the same reason. They're packed in. They don't have as much cleaning going on as you see in this other areas just because of religious practices. We're also going to see it impact India. So culture plays a large part here in the spread of plague. It's just, in this case, it was the religion that's saying that you need to, wash your hands before every meal and those kind of things. And other places just didn't have that, like I said, as part of their culture. Or maybe the plague spread not because of cleanliness, just because they were more packed in population, right? And so how does it actually spread? So this is a virus. The Black Death or the bubonic plague is a virus that lives in the bloodstream of fleas. And so if you are traveling from place to place and you're a merchant, you might have fleas on your clothes. They might bite you. You've got the plague, right? Some plagues will spread because of airborne stuff, right? Some are viral, and they spread by water droplets. So when you sneeze next to somebody or you're close to them and you breathe on them, that they can travel that way as well. And so it can travel in the bloodstream of fleas that will bite you, or it'll be airborne. So right, there's two different kind of main versions of it. And so as we'll talk about in our Europe notes, it is a horrible way to go, obviously, and it's very devastating. And so we see this pattern. It starts in China, and then it moves its way across the Silk Roads and impacting, decimating populations, some more than others, as we go from east to west. All right. This is also a reason we're going to see for urban decline. So wherever you are, whether you're in areas that are heavily impacted or less impacted, we're going to see that the biggest group of people that die from the Black Plague are going to be people living in cities because they're just physically closer to each other. If you're a farmer, you're more spread out, and so you're not as impacted. There's less of a chance of transference from person to person. But we're going to see that urban areas, they're just because they're densely packed and are also destination for these merchants. So unwittingly, the merchants carry the plague from one location to another as they trade, and all of a sudden it's released on a new city with no, with 100% susceptibility, with no immunity, and it's going to spread quickly through that city and wipe out the city. And so we're going to see people just physically die, so so urban decline, or we're going to see people get freaked out, and they know that cities are more have a higher mortality rate, and so they're going to leave the city. And so here we see that there's going to be urban increases in this time period because trade is going to make urban cities go up because that's where all the trade is. And then we're also going to see periods of urban decline when people are just dying off because of these pathogens. All right. So let's kind of also talk about other things that are going on because of the Silk Road. So we've talked about diseases and languages and religions. We're also going to see ideas travel along the Silk Roads. And so, for example, the Chinese discovered how to make paper. And so that idea is going to make its way to India along the Silk Roads. It's going to kind of take a left turn, and we're going to find out that merchants are going to bring it back from the Silk Roads to India. And then, of course, the Islamic world is going to learn about paper making. And you have to read the Quran. And so it would be great if everybody could have affordable material to read the Quran on. And so more people can read it. And so, okay, we see the Muslim world is really going to like paper. And, of course, eventually Europe is going to get paper. And so once again, it's this trend of things going from east to west along the Silk Roads. The Chinese invent gunpowder. Taoist monks invent gunpowder, and the formula for that is going to make its way from east to west, eventually reaching Europe. Citrus fruits. Oranges are from China originally. They were domesticated there. And so these seeds for the oranges are going to be taken across the Silk Roads, and people are going to start growing them in new regions. And so that's a crop that eventually makes its way from east to west. And eventually it'll make its way to Europe and the southern part of Europe where they have warm enough temperatures to grow oranges. And this will be a huge impact on Europe because it's an important source of vitamin C, and you need that to live. And the Europeans just didn't have much access to that. And so we're seeing, crops are going across the Silk Roads. Also rice making, with different kinds of rice. We had talked about in our last set of notes that from Vietnam down here that the Chinese get this new faster growing rice called champa rice, and they're going to take some of those seeds, and so that's going to make its way to India, right? And then it's going to make its way to Southwest Asia. And so we're going to see this is another crop that's making its way. Now from India, we're going to get a crop that was domesticated there, cotton. And so, of course, cotton is going to be a crop that is in much demand because if you live in a hot area, you're going to want to have clothes that breathe made from cotton. It's much better than wool. And so we're going to see cotton become a major export from India along the Silk Roads. I mean, we've also talked about some of this stuff is going on in maritime trade in the Indian Ocean as well, but today we're focusing on the Silk Roads. Right. Here we talked about Arabic numerals. We have said that before. So on the Silk Roads, we have merchants going back and forth across the Silk Roads, and Arabic numerals actually originate here in India. Muslims learn about them, hence Arabic, and so they're going to adopt them, and then eventually with trade through the Byzantine Empire, Christian Europe is going to find out about it, or trade with the Italian city-states, Christian Europe is going to find out about them, and so Christians will adopt in Europe Arabic numerals, which originally came from India. Next crop, alfalfa. So alfalfa is originally domesticated in Persia, right here in Southwest Asia, and so that's something people can eat, but even more importantly, it's a crop that horses can eat. And so alfalfa is a great source of nutrients for horses, and it makes the horses grow bigger, stronger, faster. And so we're going to see that alfalfa is going to be starting to be grown in other areas, and especially it's going to make its way to Europe eventually. And so if you've ever had these image of medieval knights where riding these huge horses, well, those horses, in order to get so big, they do breed the bigger horses to get them bigger, but also that they become bigger, stronger, faster by eating alfalfa. And so we see that that's going to have an impact on the European culture when eventually that crop gets there because of Silk Road trade. All right. So the Mongol Empire, we've made the point they're big and they have a huge impact on world history, whether it's religion or language or diseases or crops or ideas. And so now let's kind of end the Mongol Empire. And so after Genghis Khan dies, what happens is all the Mongols come back together from wherever they are, and they have a big meeting, and they try to decide, well, who should be the new ruler. And what they decide on is they should split the empire up into 4 parts. And so what we call these are khanates, which is Mongolian for like kingdom, if you will. And so we're going to have the Empire of the Great Khan, which later on in the part 2 of the lecture we're going to talk about is the Yuan dynasty. Over here in Central Asia, it's going to be a Central Asian Khanate. And then we have the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which we're going to talk about when we get to Russia, basically. And then we have the Ilkhanate of Persia, which is going to be down here in Persia or modern-day Iran. And so here are the 4 major things, right? Now, the Sultanate of Delhi down here, remember I had said that the Mongols never conquer India. So the Sultanate of Delhi is spared, but later descendant of Genghis Khan will eventually invade India and turn it into the Mughal Empire, but that's in a different time period. All right, and so we have these huge 4 khanates that have divided the empire up. All right. Now, they rule independently of each other. Each one has their great Khan, their great ruler. Now, they don't really want to make war against each other. We'll talk about that in a second, because their emphasis, ever since Genghis Khan, is we've set the precedent that we're not going to fight each other. We're going to expand outward. And so they're going to try to keep that tradition, right? And so they do extend their conquest even further than Genghis Khan did, right? Genghis Khan didn't conquer all of China, but now we'll see his grandson, Kublai Khan, he will even conquer into southern China, and so they'll take even more of it, right? Genghis Khan did not conquer this far west in Europe, but we're going to see the Khanate of the Golden Horde will conquer even further into Europe. You get the idea, all right? And so they're going to extend their conquest. Every once in a while, there'll be a little bit bad blood between these khanates, and there'll be sporadic fighting. But for the most part, like I said, Genghis Khan kind of created the precedent that we're not going to fight among each other, and we want peace within these khanates, because if we have peace, right, we have Silk Road trade, and that's good for all of these khanates because they can tax that trade and get wealthy off of it. And so it's in their interest to keep peace among all of these khanates. All right, so that continued to allow trade. All right, so now let's look at the learning objectives for part 1. Number 1, identify the states that the Mongol Empire replaced. So we talked about them conquering the Sung dynasty in China, or at least part of it. We talked about them conquering parts in Southwest Asia, and we talked about them conquering other parts in Central Asia, and we talked about them not conquering, notably enough at the time, India, the Sultanate of Delhi, but later on they will. All right, next, the Seljuk Empire we had talked about in Southwest Asia. Next, number 2, explain why trade increased in Eurasia under Mongol rule. And we just said it was safe to trade. The Mongols wanted to promote trade, and so they had the Pax Mongolia, right? This time where everybody had these passes, and if you were a merchant, you were safe to trade. So as you trade from oasis to oasis on the Silk Roads, you feel safe. You're not going to be robbed. Everybody knows not to mess with the Mongols. All right, list the goods, religions, languages, and pathogens that moved along the Silk Road. So we'll just give you an example of each one again. The goods, we said, hey, cotton is going to move along the Silk Roads, or silk. We said religions, and so we talked about Nestorian Christianity or Buddhism. Right? Languages, we talked about Uyghur and Arabic are going to move along the Silk Roads. And then pathogens, we talked about the Black Death, the bubonic plague. Number 4, describe what happened to the Mongolian Empire after the death of Genghis Khan. And we said it was divided. They're going to continue to conquer, but they're going to try to keep internal warfare down so they continue to have trade at the time. That's it for part A. Next up, when we talk about part B, we'll do a more in-depth analysis of the different khanates. We'll talk about the Yuan dynasty, we'll talk about the Ilkhanate of Persia and the Ilkhanate of the Golden Horde.